Caesar's legion is by most accounts the most feared and brutal force in the Mojave. 87 wasteland tribes united into an army poised to seize New Vegas and deal a potentially fatal blow to the new California Republic. Caesar himself, as I've come to understand him, is sort of Alexander the Great meets Lord Humongous, but a hedgehog. Which will make a lot more sense as we unpack this. First, the Legion itself is a bit of an enigma. It's more a nomadic army than a nation, and yet it has managed to maintain law and order in its territory more successfully than the NCR and is often claimed to be the most stable environment for commerce in the region. How one views the Legion depends very much on their priorities and morality. For some, they are nothing more than brutal slavers, an overgrown raider gang. Others point out that the roads are safe for merchants to travel and that a brutal world demands a brutal form of civilization.
And Legion, from what I've heard, they don't do the stop tolls on the roads or in the outposts like some NCR quartermasters do. Much as I hate the Legion, caravan life would be a hell of a lot easier if they ran the roads. Well, as long as those companies were run by men. And that's the biggest issue I see.
Back in the good old days of 2246, the land was dotted with little tribes. None of this idyllic noble savage bullshit. They were all murderous screwheads, but they all had their own cultures. Edward Sallow, a scientist with a group calling itself the Followers of the Apocalypse, was captured by one of these tribes, along with some colleagues, and a battle was looming. Facing the prospect of being slaughtered when his captors were defeated and their village taken.
It's one thing to be taken hostage, another to be lashed to a sinking ship. So over Calhoun's objections, I decided to take certain steps.
Eddie decided his best shot at survival was to help them win by teaching them unit tactics on the level of their technology. And so he became a hero to the tribe and led them to many more conquests. At which point he upped the game and began forging the regional languages and cultures into a single Neo-Roman society in a strict and unforgiving, almost wasteland totalitarian super tribe.
It means a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers.
It's important to note that Edward, now self-appointed Caesar, didn't choose the Roman model out of delusion or mere classical fetishism. He's working within an ideological framework and he has clear goals. His choices are based on practicality. He picked Rome because he thinks it'll work.
In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world. A society that could and would survive.
At least, that's what he says. Observation shows that he frequently does wildly impractical things. For example, after the Legion's first defeat by the NCR, he threw a hissy fit and had his second-in-command, Joshua Graham, set on fire and tossed into the Grand Canyon. Because loyal commanders learning from experience isn't something the Legion is going to put up with. Death is a common punishment for mission failure, even if it's due to circumstances beyond their control.
When another legatus or a centurion fails to achieve results, I send Linnaeus to make things right. His first step is to beat the failed commander to death in front of his assembled troops. Then he orders the ritual of decimatio.
The Legion almost defeats itself. Caesar refuses to use any mechanization in his army and even restricts firearms to certain units. Because in his worldview, war is not merely a means of exerting power, but an act of sacrifice. A sacrifice in blood that must not be sullied by cowardly, but utterly practical things like using long-range bombardment or robots. After the Legion's defeat at the First Battle of Hoover Dam, Kaiser Eddie never considers that his plan may have been flawed, that outside factors thwarted his army, or that perhaps his goal of uniting and civilizing the wasteland and militarily defeating the NCR at the dam were not the same objective. Conflating means and ends. After that defeat, instead of analyzing what happened, he blames subordinates. He has a vision of how the world should be, and he blames his own people when the world doesn't conform. Part of this is that to Caesar, retreat is not a tactical maneuver, but a moral failing. He has a very romanticized view of war, a view colored by his preferences and presuppositions more than objective assessment. We can't dismiss him as merely a liar or a delusional warlord. Kaiser is sincere because he is trapped in his own ideological framework. Going back a bit further than Rome, there is a fragment of Greek poetry that translates as, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." In the 1950s, the political theorist Isaiah Berlin wrote an essay elaborating on the fox and the hedgehog as worldview archetypes. Applied to politics and philosophy, looking at the world through a single big idea ideology is hedgehog behavior.
The fundamental premise is to envision history as a sequence of dialectical conflicts. Each dialectic begins with a proposition, a thesis, which inherently contains or creates its opposite, an antithesis. Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable, but the resolution of the conflict yields something new, a synthesis, eliminating the flaws in each, leaving behind common elements and ideas.
Ideology is a map of the world around us. It puts things in context, shows where they are in relation to each other, and allows us to navigate the political and philosophical realm. But a map also shapes what we pay attention to. It's by nature simplified, and it omits more than it illustrates. Being wedded to an ideology, regardless of what it is like having only one map. A road atlas is fine if you're sticking to the roads, but when venturing further afield, it's much more practical to have a big bag full of maps that you can pull from depending on where you are and what you're trying to do. Let the landscape determine the map you use rather than trying to impose your map on the landscape. Foxes are quick and flighty. They'll do what works in any given situation. To mix these metaphors, foxes switch maps whenever it suits them. Caesar, the hedgehog, only has one. He knows one big thing. Dialectical models can be good tools for analyzing the interaction of ideas, but they're kinda trash as the basis for political programs or at predicting the development of human societies and nations. One of the best meta-narrative aspects of New Vegas is that Caesar talks of inevitabilities, and yet the fate of his legion depends entirely on you, the player, and what choices you make. He's trapped in his deterministic model of the world, but his fate is entirely dependent on what you choose to do. But the blinding totalitarianism of his ideology also plays on a more basic level. The Legion is at first glance a fusion of cultures, perspectives, experiences, hammer-forged into a single mold with a single worldview. But it isn't a synthesis. It's a top-down imposition of a single vision. Its constituent cultures aren't absorbed, but brutally destroyed. The men are either conscripted in the Legion army and subjected to its discipline at all times, or killed. The women are enslaved, and any surviving children are raised within the Legion. And for all this fixation on Rome, Caesar jumps straight to the Empire, skipping over the Republic and its long building up of institutions. He's less Caesar and more Alexander, leading his army on a perpetual campaign of conquest. There's a very high probability that, like Alexander, his empire will die with him because it has nothing else holding it together. But he has a very different idea of where it's all going.
Thesis and antithesis. The Colorado River is my Rubicon. The NCR Council will be eradicated. But the new synthesis will change the Legion as well. From a basically nomadic army to a standing military force that protects its citizens and the power of its dictator.
The Legion is 100% committed to this. It's from the ground up an army, not a state, and it's trying to expand too fast to develop any unifying cultural basis beyond military discipline. Its economic capacity seems to barely keep up with keeping the army going for another day on its bloody march to the sea. If, despite Caesar treating war as a ritualized blood sacrifice as much as a means of furthering political or territorial goals, the Legion defeats the NCR, is there any reason to believe it will be able to transition into a stationary state army that holds rather than takes territory and functions as part of a stable society? The Legion ending tells us only this.
Caesar entered the Strip as though it was his triumph. The Legion pushed the NCR out of New Vegas entirely, driving them back to the Mojave outpost. The Legion occupied all major locations, enslaving much of the population and peacefully lording over the rest. Under the Legion's banner, civilization, unforgiving as it was finally came to the Mojave Wasteland.
But to simply rule over a conquered population isn't the same as governing or building a stable state. In order to create these kinds of socio-political hybrids, the constituent parts need to have several points of compatibility. It's a process not of synthesis in a philosophical sense, but a much broader idea of cultural diffusion, an exchange of ideas and customs in a natural and haphazard way. Two things taking ideas from each other, but still remaining essentially what they are. It may seem like an academic distinction, but the key is that the Legion is structured in a way that makes the exchange impossible. The whole thing is built on crushing tribal cultures and assimilating the people into this massive Roman knockoff army. There can be no synthesis with the Legion because the Legion can't survive with regional differences and an interplay of ideas. Wasteland totalitarian, tolerating nothing outside the state, but skipping the process of actually building that state. There is a way that Kaiser Eddie could do this, but it would involve switching models. If he relaxed the Roman shtick and flipped more toward the Mongols. They didn't attempt to suppress local cultures, and in fact, through trade routes, facilitated an explosion of cultural exchange. Taking over the tax system of conquered kingdoms is much more cost-effective than trying to remake their society. It results in something that could be called synthesis of a sort, but in this case it would involve the Legion becoming more like the NCR than the other way around, just as the Mongol conquerors adopted customs and languages of the people they ruled and had a tendency to go native, so would the Legion. But this would require Kaiser to relax his grip and take a broader view, to see that philosophy is about thinking, but often doesn't translate directly into doing. And if his goal is truly to build something stable,
a society that could prevent mankind from fracturing and destroying itself in this new world by establishing a new Pax Romana,
he must accept that he can't build a solid foundation and a tower on top of it at the same time. He must prioritize, balance the desired against the attainable, and learn that sometimes the fastest route to a destination isn't plowing straight through a mountain. But then he wouldn't be Kaiser. He'd be some unstoppable synthesis of a hedgehog and a fox, which, hey, it's Fallout. Stranger things roam the world.
Fuck this. I'm going to lie down. Come back later. Tomorrow.